Maya Chen sat on the floor of what used to be her bedroom, staring at the empty space where the dresser had been. The afternoon sunlight cut across the hardwood in sharp angles, highlighting every dust particle floating in the air. 3 weeks. She had 3 weeks until her wedding day, and now she had nothing. Well, not nothing. She had a maxed-out credit card, a car with a questionable transmission, and a phone that wouldn't stop buzzing with messages from concerned friends asking if the rumors were true. She'd stopped answering 2 days ago. The apartment felt like a crime scene. David had been methodical about it. He'd taken his clothes, obviously, but he'd also taken the coffee maker they'd picked out together, the throw pillows from the couch, half the dishes, the good knife set, even the picture frames, though he'd at least left the photos in a neat stack on the kitchen counter. Maya had thrown those away without looking at them. What he'd really taken, though, was $43,000 from their joint savings account, money she'd been setting aside for years, money that was supposed to be their down payment on a house, money that represented every extra shift she'd worked, every lunch she'd packed instead of buying, every vacation she'd skipped. Gone. Her phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen. Another message from her mother. Another one from her best friend Chen. Another from the wedding venue asking about final head count. Maya turned the phone face down and pressed her palms against her eyes. She was 34 years old. She had a master's degree in architecture from a prestigious university. She'd been working at one of Denver's top firms for 6 years. She was supposed to have her life figured out by now. Instead, she was sitting on the floor of an apartment she could no longer afford, trying to figure out how someone she'd loved for 3 years could vanish like morning fog. The worst part wasn't even the money. It was the note he'd left. Just 3 sentences scrawled on the back of a grocery receipt. "I'm sorry. I can't do this anymore. I hope you find someone who deserves you." As if that made it better. As if those words could somehow cushion the blow of discovering that the man she'd planned to marry had been planning his exit for who knows how long. As if, "I hope you find someone who deserves you," meant anything when he'd left her holding the bag for a wedding venue that wouldn't refund the deposit, a dress that hung in the closet like a ghost, and an apartment lease with both their names on it. Maya stood up slowly. Her legs had fallen asleep from sitting on the hard floor, and pins and needles shot through her calves. She walked to the window and looked out at the street below. People were going about their normal Saturday activities, walking dogs, carrying groceries, living their lives as if the world hadn't just tilted sideways. She needed to get out of here. The decision came suddenly, the way important decisions sometimes do. She couldn't stay in this apartment another night. Couldn't sleep in that bed. Couldn't wake up and make coffee in a kitchen that still smelled faintly like the cologne David wore. She needed to move, to drive, to put miles between herself and this disaster. 20 minutes later, Maya had thrown clothes into a duffel bag without really looking at what she was packing. She grabbed her laptop, her phone charger, and the emergency cash she kept in an envelope in her desk drawer. $240. It would have to be enough. She left her key on the kitchen counter next to the stack of photos. Let David deal with breaking the lease. Let him explain to the landlord why they were leaving early. She was done cleaning up his messes. The Honda Civic started with its usual reluctant cough. Maya had been meaning to get it serviced for months, but there'd always been something more important. Now the check engine light glowed cheerfully from the dashboard, joining the low tire pressure warning that had been on for weeks. She ignored both and pulled out of the parking lot. She drove west without really thinking about it, west toward the mountains, toward the peaks that had always made her feel small in a good way. The kind of small that reminded you your problems were just tiny blips in the grand scheme of things. Denver sprawled behind her, and soon the suburbs thinned out into rolling foothills. The radio played some pop song about love and heartbreak, and Maya jabbed the power button to turn it off. She didn't need a soundtrack for this. The silence was better. Just the hum of the engine and the whisper of wind through the crack she'd opened in the window. Highway 70 climbed steadily into the mountains. Maya passed through mountain towns she'd visited with David on weekend trips. Idaho Springs, where they'd stopped for lunch once. Georgetown, where they'd browsed antique shops. Each familiar landmark felt like a small betrayal, a reminder that her memories were now divided into before and after. The gas light came on somewhere past Georgetown, but Maya kept driving. She'd stop when she found a place that felt far enough away, a place where nobody knew her story, where she could just exist for a while without having to explain or justify or make sense of anything. The afternoon stretched into early evening. The summer sun hung low but refused to set, the way it does in the mountains. Maya turned onto a smaller highway, then an even smaller road. She wasn't following a map. She was following the impulse to keep moving, to put distance between herself and the ruins of her old life. That's when the car made a sound it had never made before, a grinding, shrieking noise that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the engine. Maya's heart jumped. She eased off the gas pedal and the noise quieted but didn't disappear entirely. "Come on," she whispered to the car, just a little further. But the Honda had other plans. The shrieking grew louder, and now there was smoke coming from under the hood. Thin wisps at first, then thicker plumes. Maya's hands tightened on the steering wheel as she scanned the roadside for a safe place to pull over. The road had narrowed to barely 2 lanes, winding through dense pine forest. No houses, no gas stations, nothing but trees and gathering shadows. Maya guided the dying car onto a small gravel pullout, just as the engine made one final terrible sound and went silent. She sat there for a moment, hands still gripping the wheel, trying not to cry. Of course this would happen. Of course her car would die on a deserted mountain road. Because this day, this terrible week, this absolute disaster of a month couldn't possibly get worse without throwing in a breakdown in the middle of nowhere. Maya pulled out her phone. No signal. She stared at the empty bars at the top of her screen and felt something crack inside her chest. This was it. This was rock bottom, sitting in a broken car with no phone signal, no money, and no plan, watching smoke curl up from her engine while the sun finally started to sink behind the mountains. She got out of the car and walked a few steps down the road, holding her phone up like some kind of desperate offering to the sky. Still no signal. The air smelled like pine and smoke and approaching rain. Dark clouds were gathering on the western horizon, moving fast the way mountain storms do. Maya walked back to the car and popped the hood, even though she had no idea what she was looking at. The engine was definitely smoking. That seemed bad. She waved her hand to clear the smoke and peered at the mess of metal and hoses, looking for something obvious. A disconnected wire maybe, or a loose cap. Something she could fix with her bare hands and sheer determination. There was nothing obvious. Just smoke and heat and the smell of burning oil. She was about to close the hood when she heard it. The low rumble of an engine coming up the road. Maya turned and saw headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. A pickup truck, old and battered, with a toolbox mounted in the bed. The truck slowed as it approached, then pulled onto the gravel beside her car. Maya's first instinct was fear. She was alone on a deserted road with a stranger. But then the door opened and a man climbed out, and something about the way he moved, slow and careful, made her relax slightly. He was older, maybe 50, with a thick gray beard and weathered skin that spoke of years spent outdoors. He wore a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up and work boots that had seen better days. His eyes were kind, though. That was the first thing Maya noticed. Kind and concerned. "Looks like you're having some trouble," he said. His voice was rough but gentle, like gravel wrapped in velvet. "My car died," Maya said, and was surprised to hear her voice crack on the last word. "I don't have cell signal, and there's a storm coming." The man nodded slowly, looking at her car, then at the sky, then back at her. "Where you headed?" "I don't know," Maya admitted. "Just away." He studied her face for a moment, and Maya had the uncomfortable feeling that he could see right through her. Could see the broken engagement and the empty bank account and the desperate need to be anywhere but here. "Well," he said finally, "this engine's not going anywhere tonight. And you're right about that storm. It's gonna be a bad one." He paused. "Name's Bear. I live about 15 miles up the road. There's a town nearby, Pine Ridge. I can tow you there if you want. Get you somewhere safe before the rain hits." Maya hesitated. Every safety lesson she'd ever learned screamed at her not to trust a stranger. But the alternative was staying here alone on this road with a dead car and an approaching storm. And something about this man, this Bear, felt solid, trustworthy. "Okay," she said quietly. "Thank you." Bear nodded once and went to work. He pulled a tow strap from his truck bed with practiced efficiency, and within minutes he had her Honda hooked up. "You can ride in your car or up front with me," he said. "Steering might be tricky if you're being towed, though." Maya climbed into the passenger seat of his truck. It smelled like sawdust and coffee and wood smoke, the kind of smells that usually meant safety and warmth. The radio was off and the dashboard was clean except for a faded photograph tucked into the sun visor. Maya caught a glimpse of a woman with a bright smile before Bear started the engine, and the photo flipped back out of sight. They drove in silence for a while. Bear handled the truck with easy confidence, navigating the winding mountain road as the first drops of rain began to fall. Maya watched the wipers sweep across the windshield and felt the tension in her shoulders finally start to ease. "Bad day?" Bear asked after a while. Maya let out a short, bitter laugh. "Bad month." He nodded but didn't push for details. They drove on through the rain, which quickly turned from drops to sheets. The mountains disappeared behind a curtain of water, and Maya was suddenly very grateful she wasn't still sitting in her car on the side of the road. "Pine Ridge isn't much," Bear said as they descended into a valley. "But folks there are good. Ruth runs the diner. She'll have a room you can stay in, above the restaurant. Nothing fancy, but it's clean and dry. I don't have much money," Maya admitted. "Ruth's not worried about money," Bear said simply. The town appeared through the rain like something from another era. One main street with maybe a dozen buildings. A general store. A post office. The diner with a neon sign that glowed warm and welcoming through the storm. Bear pulled the truck up in front and turned off the engine. "Come on," he said. "Let's get you inside." Maya followed him through the rain, and as she stepped through the door of Ruth's diner, something inside her finally broke open. Maybe it was the warmth. Maybe it was the smell of coffee and home-cooked food. Maybe it was just the relief of being somewhere solid after hours of driving and breaking down and falling apart. Or maybe it was the simple kindness of a stranger who'd stopped on a mountain road and said, in his quiet way, that she didn't have to figure this out alone. Whatever it was, Maya knew that something had shifted. The life she'd been living was over, and whatever came next, it would start here, in this small mountain town, with a broken car and $240 and a future that was completely, terrifyingly blank. The diner was exactly what Maya needed without knowing she needed it. Warm yellow light spilled from old-fashioned fixtures, and the air smelled like fresh coffee and something baking. A handful of people sat at the counter and in booths, their conversations creating a low, comfortable hum. When Bear pushed open the door, every head turned. "Evening." "Bear," called a man in a John Deere cap from the counter. "Storm's really coming down," added a woman sitting near the window. Bear nodded to them both and guided Maya toward the back, where an older woman with silver hair pulled into a neat bun was refilling coffee cups. She looked up as they approached, and her eyes, sharp and knowing behind wire-rimmed glasses, took in Maya's wet clothes and haunted expression in one quick glance. "Ruth," Bear said simply. "This is Maya. Her car broke down up on Mountain Pass Road. She needs a place to stay." Ruth set down the coffee pot and wiped her hands on her apron. She was maybe 70, with the kind of face that had earned its wrinkles through years of smiling. "Well then," she said, her voice carrying the faint trace of a southern accent. "Sit down, honey. You look like you could use some hot food and a dry place to think." Maya opened her mouth to explain about the money, about how she could only afford maybe one night, but Ruth was already pulling out a chair at an empty booth. "Go on, sit. I'll bring you something warm." Bear slid into the seat across from her. "Ruth owns this place. Has the apartment upstairs. It's small, but it's yours if you need it." "I can't pay much," Maya said, the words tumbling out. "My fiancé, he took all our savings, and I lost my deposit on the wedding venue, and my car just died, and I only have $200 and—" She stopped abruptly, surprised by the sudden tightness in her throat. Ruth appeared with 2 mugs of coffee and set them down gently. "First things first. You eat, you rest, and tomorrow we'll figure out the details. The room's been empty for 3 months anyway. Rather have someone in it than let it sit." She patted Maya's shoulder. "Nobody's kicking you out into a storm, sweetheart." Maya wrapped her hands around the warm mug and felt tears prick at her eyes. She'd spent the last week fielding phone calls from vendors demanding payment, from friends offering hollow sympathy, from her mother asking over and over how she could have missed the signs. Nobody had just offered kindness without conditions. Nobody had just said it would be okay. Ruth returned with 2 plates, pot roast with carrots and potatoes, the kind of meal that tasted like comfort and home. Maya realized she hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. She picked up her fork and took a bite, and it was so good she almost started crying again. Bear ate slowly, methodically, like someone used to eating alone. Between bites, he said, I can look at your car tomorrow. Might be able to fix it, might not. But we'll figure it out. Why are you helping me? Maya asked. The question came out more blunt than she intended. Bear looked up from his plate, those kind eyes steady on her face. Because you need help. And because a long time ago when I needed help, this town showed up for me. That's how it works here. Before Maya could respond, Ruth slid into the booth next to Bear with her own cup of coffee. So, she said, in the tone of someone settling in for a story. What brings you to our little corner of nowhere? Maya found herself telling them everything. About David and the empty apartment and the wedding that wasn't going to happen. About driving west with no destination in mind. About the car breaking down just as the storm rolled in. The words spilled out like water from a broken dam, and Ruth and Bear just listened. They didn't offer advice or platitudes. They didn't tell her it would all work out or that she was better off without him. They just listened. When she finally ran out of words, Ruth squeezed her hand. Well, she said, sounds like that man did you a favor, even if it doesn't feel like it yet. Takes a special kind of coward to run away instead of being honest. 15 years I've been running this diner, Ruth continued. You know how many people I've seen come through here running from something? Dozens. Some running from bad relationships, some from bad jobs, some from bad decisions. And you know what I learned? Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the door opening to something better. Maya wanted to believe that. But right now, sitting in wet clothes with a broken car and a broken life, it was hard to see any doors opening. Bear cleared their plates and came back with a piece of apple pie that he set in front of Maya. Ruth's pie fixes most problems, he said. At least temporarily. The pie was still warm with a flaky crust and cinnamon-spiced apples that melted on her tongue. Maya ate slowly, savoring each bite, and felt some of the tension leave her body. Tell me about your car, Bear said. What was it doing before it died? Maya described the grinding noise, the smoke, the way it had just given up. Bear listened, asking occasional questions, and Maya realized he was actually diagnosing the problem in his head. This wasn't just polite conversation. He genuinely wanted to help. Could be the transmission, he said finally. Could be the head gasket. Won't know until I get under the hood in daylight, but I've got tools and a garage. We'll figure it out. I can't afford a mechanic, Maya admitted quietly. Good thing I'm not a mechanic then, Bear said with the ghost of a smile. I'm a carpenter, but I fix things. Cars, houses, furniture, whatever needs fixing. Ruth stood and pulled a key from her apron pocket. Come on, honey. Let me show you the apartment. You need rest more than anything right now. Maya followed Ruth through a door at the back of the diner and up a narrow staircase. The apartment was small, just one room with a kitchenette in the corner, a bed by the window, and a tiny bathroom. But it was clean and warm, with cheerful yellow curtains and a quilt on the bed that looked handmade. Bathroom's small but functional, Ruth said. Towels in the closet. There's coffee and some basics in the kitchen. Rent's $300 a month, includes utilities. You can pay me when you can. $300? Maya repeated. In Denver, she'd been paying $1,200 for her half of a one-bedroom. It's not fancy, Ruth said with a shrug, but it's home. After Ruth left, Maya stood in the middle of the room and tried to process everything that had happened in the last 6 hours. She'd driven into the mountains with no plan. Her car had died. A stranger had towed her to a tiny town she'd never heard of, and now she was standing in an apartment that cost less per month than her car payment used to be, being offered kindness by people who didn't know her at all. She walked to the window and looked out at the rain. The main street was empty now, the diner's neon sign reflecting in puddles. Beyond the town, the mountains rose dark against a darker sky. Maya pressed her forehead against the cool glass and let herself cry. Not the angry, bitter tears of the last week, but something deeper, a release of everything she'd been holding together. When she finally climbed into bed an hour later, she expected to lie awake replaying the disaster of her life. Instead, she fell asleep to the sound of rain on the roof and slept more deeply than she had in months. Morning came with sunlight streaming through those yellow curtains. Maya woke disoriented, forgetting for a moment where she was. Then it all came back. The apartment, the town, the broken car and broken plans. She got up and looked out the window. Pine Ridge looked different in daylight, small but charming, with flower boxes on some of the windows and a view of the mountains that took her breath away. The storm had cleared, leaving everything washed clean and bright. Maya showered in the tiny bathroom, grateful for the hot water, and put on the least wrinkled clothes from her hastily packed bag. When she came downstairs, the diner was already busy with breakfast customers. Ruth waved her over to a spot at the counter. "Coffee?" Ruth asked, already pouring. "Please," Maya said. Ruth slid a menu in front of her, but Maya barely glanced at it. "What's good?" "Everything," Ruth said with a grin. "But the pancakes are legendary." While Maya waited for her food, she watched the morning rhythm of the diner. Ruth moved with efficient grace, refilling coffee and taking orders and chatting with customers who clearly came here for more than just the food. This was the town's living room, Maya realized, the place where people connected. Bear came in just as Ruth set down a stack of golden pancakes in front of Maya. He nodded to her and took a seat at the counter, ordering coffee and eggs without needing to look at the menu. "Slept okay?" he asked. "Better than I have in weeks," Maya admitted. "Good." He sipped his coffee. "I'm heading out to look at your car after breakfast. You're welcome to come along if you want." Maya did want. She wanted to understand what was wrong, what it would cost, whether it could be fixed at all. They drove out to where her Honda sat forlorn on the side of the road, looking even more pathetic in daylight. Bear popped the hood and spent 20 minutes poking around, checking fluids, testing connections. Finally, he straightened up. "Head gasket's blown. That's the bad news. Good news is it's fixable. Parts will run you about $200. Labor's free because I'm going to teach you how to do it yourself." Maya stared at him. "You're going to teach me? You're an architect, right?" "That's what Ruth said. You understand how things fit together. This isn't that different. Just smaller pieces and more grease," and he closed the hood. "Plus, you should know how to fix your own car. Gives you independence." Over the next 3 days, Maya learned more about car engines than she'd learned in her entire life. Bear was a patient teacher, explaining each step, letting her do the work while he guided. They worked in his garage, a neat space filled with tools hung on pegboards and the smell of sawdust and motor oil. Between teaching her about torque specs and gasket sealant, Bear told her about himself. He'd been married once, 15 years ago. His wife had been pregnant with their first child. There'd been an accident on these same mountain roads, black ice and bad timing. He'd lost them both in one terrible moment. "I fell apart after that," Bear said quietly, his hands steady as he showed Maya how to torque down a bolt. "Spent 2 years just existing. Barely left my cabin. Barely spoke to anyone. What changed?" Maya asked. "Ruth," he said simply. "She started bringing food to my place. Just leaving it on the porch at first because I wouldn't open the door. Then one day she knocked and didn't leave until I let her in. She sat at my table and said, 'You can grieve and you can hurt, but you can't disappear. Your wife wouldn't want that.'" He paused. She was right. Maya thought about that as she worked. About how grief could swallow you whole if you let it. About how sometimes it took someone else's stubbornness to pull you back. On the 4th day, they finished the repair. Bear turned the key and the Honda's engine started with a smooth purr. Maya felt a surge of pride so strong it surprised her. She'd fixed this. With help, yes, but she'd done the actual work. "Now you know you can take care of yourself," Bear said, wiping his hands on a rag. "That's worth more than the cost of parts." That evening, Ruth invited Maya down for dinner after the diner closed. Just the 3 of them, sitting at a booth while Ruth brought out leftovers and fresh bread. The conversation wandered from town gossip to philosophy to Maya's work as an architect. "So what's your plan now?" Ruth asked. "Your car's fixed. You could head back to Denver." Maya had been thinking about that same question for days. She could go back, try to rebuild her life there, find a new apartment, face the pitying looks of coworkers, sort through the mess David had left behind. Or she could stay here, in this strange little town where people helped strangers and taught them how to fix their own cars, where rent was cheap and the mountains were breathtaking and nobody knew her as the girl who got left 3 weeks before her wedding. "I don't know," Maya said honestly. "Denver doesn't feel like home anymore. But I don't know if anywhere does." Bear leaned back in the booth, considering. "You know what I do besides fix cars and build things?" He didn't wait for an answer. "I build custom log homes. Cabins mostly, for people who want something real, something they can pass down. I've got a project starting next week, actually. Big cabin for a family from Texas. Could use someone who understands design and structure." "Are you offering me a job?" Maya asked, surprised. "Temporary work," Bear corrected. "Just until you figure out what's next." Pays decent and you'd learn something useful. Plus, you're an architect. Might be good to remember why you fell in love with building things in the first place. Maya looked at Ruth, who was smiling into her coffee cup. Is this a pity offer? This is a practical offer, Bear said. I need help. You need work. And maybe you need some time to figure out who you are when someone else isn't defining you. That last sentence hit Maya right in the chest, because that's exactly what had happened with David. She'd become whatever he needed her to be, shrinking and adjusting until she barely recognized herself. Okay, Maya said, the decision settling in her bones with surprising certainty. I'll do it, at least for a while. Ruth raised her coffee mug. To new beginnings and second chances. They clinked mugs, coffee, and ceramic instead of champagne and crystal, and Maya felt something shift inside her. Not hope exactly, not yet, but maybe the first small foundation stone of it. The sense that she could build something here. Not the life she'd planned, but maybe something better. Something that was actually hers. The cabin site sat in a clearing about 10 miles outside Pine Ridge. Surrounded by pine trees and overlooking a valley that seemed to stretch forever, Maya stood at the edge of the foundation that had already been poured. Her architect's eye immediately cataloging the dimensions, the slope of the land, the way the morning sun would hit the windows. What do you think? Bear asked, coming up beside her with a thermos of coffee. It's beautiful, Maya said honestly. But the plans are wrong, Bear raised an eyebrow. Wrong how? Maya pulled out the rolled blueprints from the truck bed and spread them across the tailgate. See here? They've got the main living area facing north. That's fine in Texas where they're from, but up here, they'll lose all the southern light in winter. And these windows are too small. You're sitting on one of the most beautiful views in Colorado, and they've designed it like they're afraid of the outdoors. She grabbed a pencil and started sketching on the margin of the plans, her hands moving with a confidence she'd forgotten she had. If you rotate the whole structure 15 degrees and expand this wall to floor-to-ceiling windows, you maximize the view and the passive solar heating. And here, this mudroom entrance, it's too small. People in the mountains need space for boots and coats and gear. Bear watched her work, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. You really are an architect, aren't you? Maya looked up, realizing she'd just taken over. Sorry, I didn't mean to. Don't apologize, Bear interrupted. You're right, all of it. I've been staring at these plans for 2 weeks thinking something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. This is why I needed you. Over the next few days, Maya learned that building with Bear was completely different from her work at the firm in Denver. There, everything was about client meetings and building codes and making sure the design looked good in renderings. Here, it was about understanding how wood moves, how weight distributes, how a building sits in its landscape. Bear taught her to read the grain of lumber, to feel when a joint was tight, to listen to the sound a hammer made when it hit a nail just right. Building isn't just science, he told her as they framed up the first wall. It's also art. You feel it as much as you calculate it. Maya found herself thinking about David less and less. Her hands were too busy, her mind too occupied with measurements and angles and the simple satisfaction of creating something real. At the Denver firm, she'd spent months designing buildings that might never get built, projects that existed only in computer renderings and client presentations. Here, every board she placed became part of something solid and permanent. The work was physically demanding in a way she'd never experienced. By the end of each day, her muscles ached and her hands were covered in small cuts and splinters. But it was a good ache, the kind that came from using your body the way it was meant to be used. She slept deeply and dreamlessly every night, too tired for the anxious thoughts that used to keep her awake. Ruth noticed the change. You're looking better, she said one morning when Maya came down for breakfast. Got some color in your cheeks. I'm working outside all day, Maya said, sliding into her usual spot at the counter. Hard not to get sun. It's more than that, Ruth said, pouring coffee. You're standing straighter, moving with purpose. That's what good work does to a person. Maya thought about that as she drove out to the site. Ruth was right. She did feel different. Stronger somehow. Not because the heartbreak had disappeared, but because she was building something that had nothing to do with David or their failed relationship. This was hers. At the site, Bear had already started work. He was teaching her traditional joinery techniques, the kind that didn't rely on nails or screws but on precise cuts and careful fitting. These joints will outlast both of us, he said, showing her how to cut a mortise and tenon. That's what building should be. Something that lasts. They worked in comfortable silence most of the time, the kind of quiet that didn't need filling. Occasionally, Bear would share a story about a previous build, or Maya would mention something from her architecture training. But mostly they just worked, the steady rhythm of saw and hammer creating its own kind of conversation. One afternoon, 3 weeks into the project, a truck pulled up to the site. A man and woman climbed out, and Maya recognized them from their photos in the project file. The clients, Kevin and Lisa Park from Austin, here to check on progress. Bear, Kevin called out, waving. Looking good. They walked the site together, and Maya hung back, assuming this was Bear's show. But he kept pulling her into the conversation, asking her to explain the design changes to show them how the window placement would work. Lisa's eyes lit up when Maya described how the morning light would fill their kitchen. This is so much better than the original plans, Lisa said. Why didn't our architect in Austin think of this? Because they weren't building for here, Maya explained. Every place has its own logic. Mountains, plains, desert, they all require different approaches. You can't just copy and paste a design. After the Parks left, happy with what they'd seen, Bear turned to Maya. You're good at this. Not just the technical stuff. You make people understand why the choices matter. Maya felt a flush of pride. At the Denver firm, she'd been the junior architect, the one who did the grunt work while senior partners took credit. Here, Bear treated her like an equal. That evening at the diner, Ruth introduced Maya to more of the town. There was Tom, who ran the general store and had opinions about everything. Carol, the postmaster, who knew everyone's business before they knew it themselves. Old George, who'd been a forest ranger for 40 years and could predict weather by the way the wind moved through the trees. They welcomed Maya without prying, accepting her presence as if she'd always been there. It was different from Denver, where friendships took months to build and always felt slightly transactional. Here, if you needed help, people showed up. If someone was struggling, the community rallied. Maya saw it firsthand when Tom's truck broke down. Within an hour, 3 people had stopped by the general store offering rides, tools, or spare parts. When Carol's mother got sick, meals appeared on her doorstep. When old George's roof leaked, half the town showed up on Saturday to patch it. This is what community used to mean everywhere, Ruth explained one night after closing. Before people got too busy to notice each other, we look out for our own here. And I'm one of your own now? Maya asked. You became one of our own the night Bear brought you through that door. Ruth said simply, that's how it works. As summer turned toward fall, the cabin took shape. Walls went up, windows got installed, the roof went on. Maya found herself thinking less about what she'd lost and more about what she was gaining. The confidence that came from working with her hands. The peace that came from being surrounded by mountains instead of traffic. The belonging that came from being part of something real. She also found herself watching Bear more closely. Not romantically exactly, though there was something appealing about his quiet competence, the way his hands moved with such certainty. But more than that, she was drawn to how he'd rebuilt himself after loss. He carried his grief, but he didn't let it define him. One day while they were installing kitchen cabinets, Maya asked him about it. How did you do it? Move forward after losing everything? Bear was quiet for a long moment, measuring a piece of trim. I didn't move forward, he said finally. Not at first. I got stuck. Spent 2 years barely living. It was Ruth who made me see I had a choice. I could let the worst thing that happened to me be the last thing. Or I could honor what I lost by building something good with what remained. That sounds hard, Maya said. Hardest thing I ever did, Bear admitted. Still is some days. But sitting in that cabin alone, disappearing into my grief, that wasn't living. That was just existing. And my wife, she would have hated that. She was all about living fully, squeezing every drop out of each day. He turned to look at Maya. You're doing the same thing right now. You had something terrible happen. You could have gone back to Denver and just gone through the motions. Instead, you're here, learning, building. That takes courage. Maya hadn't thought of it as courage. It had felt more like desperation, like running away. But maybe Bear was right. Maybe choosing to rebuild instead of just survive was its own kind of bravery. That night, she pulled out her laptop for the first time in weeks. Her email inbox was full of messages she'd been ignoring. Wedding vendors wanting final payments. Friends checking in. Her supervisor at the firm asking when she'd be back. And buried in the middle, an email from David. Her finger hovered over the delete button. Then, almost against her will, she opened it. The message was long and rambling. He was sorry. He'd made a terrible mistake. He'd been scared of commitment, of responsibility, of everything their life together represented. He was seeing a therapist now. He wanted to talk. He wanted to try again. Could she please call him? Maya read it twice, waiting to feel something. Anger, maybe. Or sadness. Or that treacherous hope that maybe things could go back to how they were. Instead, she felt nothing. Or not nothing exactly, but a kind of distant curiosity, like reading about someone else's life. The woman who would have taken David back, who would have believed he'd changed, who would have tried to make it work. That woman didn't exist anymore. She hit reply and typed 4 sentences. Thank you for your email. I'm glad you're getting help. I hope you figure out what you want from life. But I won't be part of it anymore. She sent it before she could second-guess herself, then closed the laptop and walked downstairs. Ruth was wiping down tables, the diner empty except for the 2 of them. David emailed, Maya said. Ruth paused mid-wipe. And I told him no. Ruth smiled, the kind of smile that held a world of understanding. Good for you, honey. That takes strength. It didn't feel strong, Maya admitted. It just felt right. That's what real strength is, Ruth said. Not the dramatic moments. Just the quiet certainty of knowing your own worth. The next morning, Maya showed up at the site with a new sketch. I've been thinking, she said to Bear, about what you said. About building something good. She spread the paper on the truck bed. It showed a small cabin design, maybe 800 square feet with a sleeping loft and a wall of windows facing the mountains. Simple but well-proportioned. The kind of space that would feel like home. What's this? Bear asked. My cabin, Maya said. Ruth mentioned she owns some land on the edge of town. Just a couple acres. She said she'd lease it to me cheap if I wanted to build something. Maya looked up at Bear. Would you help me? Not for free, I'll pay you. But I want to learn how to build it myself. Really build it from foundation to roof. Bear studied the sketch, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. He left you standing in the dust, Bear said quietly, echoing words from weeks ago. Then let me build you a home. Not build me a home, Maya corrected gently. Teach me to build my own home. There's a difference, Bear nodded slowly. Yeah, there is. And that's even better. They shook hands on it there in the clearing, the half-finished cabin behind them and Maya's future beginning to take shape. She didn't know if she'd stay in Pine Ridge forever. Didn't know if this was her permanent path or just a stopping point on the way to something else. But for the first time since David left, she felt like she was building towards something instead of running away from something. That evening, the whole town gathered at Ruth's diner for what they called a community supper. Everyone brought food, and the tables were pushed together into one long row. Maya sat between Ruth and old George, listening to stories and laughter, feeling the warmth of belonging settle around her shoulders like a comfortable blanket. Tom raised his glass of sweet tea. To Maya, he said, Pine Ridge's newest resident builder. Everyone echoed the toast, and Maya felt tears prick at her eyes. Not sad tears this time, something else entirely. Gratitude, maybe. A recognition that she'd found something she hadn't known she was looking for. A family, a purpose, a foundation solid enough to build on. And somewhere between the pot roast and the apple pie, between the stories and the laughter, Maya realized she was happy. Not the desperate, grasping happiness that depended on someone else, but the quiet, steady kind that came from knowing exactly who you were and what you were capable of building. The first snow came in early October, dusting the mountains white and turning Pine Ridge into something from a postcard. Maya stood on the small piece of land Ruth had leased her, watching her breath form clouds in the cold air. The foundation for her cabin had been poured 2 weeks ago, and now they were racing against winter to get the structure enclosed before the heavy snows arrived. Bear had warned her this would be the hardest part. Not the physical labor, though that was demanding enough, but the mental challenge of building something entirely her own, making every decision, living with every choice. When you build for someone else, their mistakes are easier to accept, he'd told her. When you build for yourself, every imperfection feels personal. He was right. Maya had spent 3 days agonizing over where to place windows, moving and rearranging until Bear finally said, At some point you have to trust yourself and commit. Now, watching the snow fall, Maya felt that familiar flutter of doubt. Was she crazy to be doing this? Building a cabin in a town she'd only lived in for 3 months? What if she wanted to leave? What if this was all just a reaction to heartbreak and she'd regret it later? Second-guessing yourself? Ruth's voice came from behind her. The older woman walked up carrying 2 thermoses, her boots crunching on the frost-covered grass. Is it that obvious? Maya asked. Ruth handed her a thermos. Hot chocolate with a hint of cinnamon. Honey, I've watched a lot of people build things in this town. Houses, businesses, new lives. They all get to this point where they wonder if they're making a huge mistake. It's normal. What if I am, though? Making a mistake? Ruth was quiet for a moment, looking out at the foundation, the neat stack of lumber waiting under tarps, the mountains rising beyond. You know what I think a real mistake is? Playing it safe because you're scared. Staying in situations that don't fit anymore because change is frightening. You've already made the brave choice. Now you just have to see it through. Bear's truck pulled up and he climbed out with his toolbox and a roll of plans. Ready to frame some walls? He called out. Over the next few weeks, Maya learned that framing a house was like solving a 3-dimensional puzzle. Every board had to be measured precisely. Every angle had to be exact. Bear showed her how to read the plans, how to translate flat drawings into standing walls, how to check for square and plumb and level. Measure twice, cut once. He repeated so often it became a mantra. And when you're not sure, stop and think it through. Rushing leads to mistakes. They worked through cold mornings and short autumn days, the cabin taking shape board by board. Tom from the general store stopped by to help install the subfloor. Old George came out to advise on the best way to orient the roof for snow load. Even Carol the postmaster showed up one Saturday with sandwiches and an extra pair of hands. This is how we do things here, Bear explained when Maya tried to thank everyone. You help build someone's house, they help build yours. It's an old tradition. Keeps communities strong. But not everything went smoothly. One afternoon, Maya was cutting rafters when she made a mistake. She'd measured wrong and the cut was off by 2 inches. 2 inches that meant the board was now useless, wasted. She stood there staring at the ruined piece of lumber, feeling frustration build in her chest. It happens, Bear said, coming over to look. Everyone makes mistakes. That's why we order extra. It was a stupid mistake, Maya said, her voice tight. I knew better. I just wasn't paying attention. You were rushing, Bear observed, trying to keep up with me. But we're not in a race. Maya sat down on a stack of lumber, suddenly exhausted. I just want to prove I can do this, that I'm not helpless, that I don't need David or anyone else to take care of me. Bear sat down next to her, his weathered hands folded in his lap. You know what I learned building by myself all these years? That independence isn't about never needing help. It's about knowing when to ask for it. You've already proven you can do hard things. You left a bad situation. You drove into the mountains with no plan. You learned to fix your own car. You're building a house with your own hands. That's not helpless. Then why do I still feel so unsure? Maya asked quietly. Because healing isn't linear, Bear said. Some days you'll feel strong. Some days you'll feel like you did when you first got here. That's normal. The difference is now you have tools and skills and people who care about you. You're not facing things alone anymore. That night, Maya couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about what Bear had said, about healing not being linear, about asking for help not being weakness. She got up and walked to the window of her small apartment, looking out at the dark street and the mountains beyond. Her phone buzzed. A text from her old supervisor in Denver. Hope you're doing well. We have a position opening up in January if you're interested in returning. You were always one of our best. Maya stared at the message. 4 months ago, she would have jumped at this. A chance to return to her old life, to pretend the whole David disaster had never happened. But now, she thought about the cabin waiting for her on the edge of town, about Ruth's diner and Bear's patient teaching, about Tom and Carol and old George and all the others who'd welcomed her without question. She typed back, "Thank you for thinking of me. I'm working on some personal projects right now and not planning to return. I wish you all the best. Send." Just like that, another door closed. But this time it felt right. Not like losing something, but like choosing something better. The next morning brought an unexpected challenge. Maya arrived at the site to find Bear standing by his truck, his face pale and strained. "I need to go into town," he said abruptly. "Doctor's appointment. Forgot about it. Is everything okay?" Maya asked, concerned. Bear waved a hand dismissively. "Annual checkup. Nothing serious. but it means we'll lose the morning. Go, Maya said. I can work on the interior wall framing. You showed me how yesterday. Bear hesitated. You sure? I'm sure. Go take care of yourself. After he left, Maya stood alone at the site for the first time. The partially framed cabin looked bigger somehow without Bear there. More intimidating. She thought about waiting for him to return, but no, she could do this. She pulled out the plans and studied the interior wall layout, measured the distances, marked the floor, cut the boards. It was slow going without Bear's experienced hands helping, but she worked methodically, checking and rechecking each measurement. By the time Bear returned in the early afternoon, she'd completed 2 interior walls. They weren't perfect, but they were square and solid and exactly where they needed to be. Bear walked around them slowly, checking her work. Then he smiled. Well done. Really well done. The pride Maya felt in that moment was better than any promotion she'd ever received at the Denver firm. As November arrived, bringing colder temperatures and the threat of serious snow, they pushed harder to get the cabin enclosed. The roof went on, then the windows. Maya learned to install insulation, to hang drywall, to tape and mud seams. Her hands were constantly rough now, her nails short and practical. She barely recognized herself in the mirror, but in a good way. She looked capable. Strong. One evening, working late to finish the exterior siding before a storm moved in, Maya and Bear fell into conversation about his wife. He didn't talk about her often, but when he did, it was with a tenderness that made Maya's chest ache. What was she like? Maya asked, nailing a board into place. Fierce, Bear said with a soft smile. That's the word that fits best. She was small, but she had this huge presence, made everyone feel seen and important. She could make friends with anyone in 5 minutes. He paused. She wanted to open a bakery here in Pine Ridge, had all these plans, recipes she'd perfected. I'm sorry you lost her, Maya said. Me too, Bear said. But I've learned something over the years. Love doesn't end just because someone's gone. It changes form, but it doesn't disappear. I carry her with me in everything I build, every choice I make. They worked in silence after that, but it was a comfortable silence, full of understanding. The storm hit that night, dumping 8 inches of snow. Maya woke to a transformed world, everything blanketed in white. She walked to the site after breakfast and found Bear already there, sweeping snow off the porch. We did it, he said, gesturing at the cabin. Structures enclosed. Now we can work inside through the winter. Maya looked at what they'd built together. Her cabin, small but solid, sitting on this land like it had always been here. I couldn't have done this without you, she said. Sure you could have, Bear replied. Would have taken longer and you'd have made more mistakes. But you'd have figured it out. That's who you are. A truck pulled up and Maya was surprised to see her mother climbing out. She hadn't told her family where she was, had barely responded to their messages, but apparently someone had tracked her down,